has there been such a massive financial weaponry buildup in the United Arab Emirates? Why has that shifted essentially from?
And we never talk about that. No one ever talks about the UAE.
No, they don't, and that's one of the most. That is one of the most despicable havens on the planet.
All right.
So please share.
Yeah. Why don't we talk about that?
The Emiratis are very good at image management. The Saudis are not terribly good. They often, MBS was trying. If people may remember his sort of charm tour in 2017 and early 2018, he came to the U.S., he came to Europe, and everyone said, "Oh, he was this great new reformer who's going to transform Saudi Arabia." But then after the Khashoggi.
I was going to say then he chopped up a journalist and shoved him in a briefcase, and so that went out the window.
Right, and he's been struggling ever since to try to reassert this sort of image management. But the UAE is very good at it, and some of that is backed up by certain policy changes that. Again, in terms of human rights abuses, that has not changed. They have not, in terms of what their own citizenry experience, it is still an extremely repressive state, similar to what Saudi citizens experience. But in general, the UAE has been very successful at sort of cultivating this image of a tolerant, open, magnet for investment and tourism and innovation. And so this is part of why when we saw the Houthi drone attacks on Abu Dhabi in January, which was the Houthis responding to the fact that the UAE had gotten back involved in Yemen. Essentially, at the end of 2019, the UAE had decided this is just too bad for our PR. Like we're going to withdraw militarily, although they did maintain control of certain strategic islands like Socotra and Mayoun. Mayoun Island is right at the very entrance, the southern entrance to the Red Sea, so a very strategically important island. But they weren't going to be on the front lines in the same way that they had been. But then what we saw in January was UAE-backed proxy forces upping their offensives in Yemen, and the Houthis responded, and they successfully sent a drone that unfortunately did kill 3 people in Abu Dhabi. And since then, the UAE has been strenuously pushing for the Houthis to be redesignated as a foreign terrorist organization. This is interesting because Trump had threatened to do this, but he only ultimately did it in the very, very final hours of his administration, in part because I think he knew it would be a PR disaster, because it would be, the effects of that would be sort of so catastrophic in terms of that there would be no aid that could get into Yemen at all. It would just be, going from the frying pan into the fire. But he did it, I think, essentially just to throw something else at Biden, that Biden would then have to deal with. And Biden very wisely lifted that designation because the effects on the provision of aid in Yemen would have been so great. But we've now seen a lot of pressure from the Saudis and the UAE to reinstate that designation, even though nothing has changed. Again, the Houthis would not be particularly affected by it. They aren't really plugged into international financial networks the way they would need to be for it to actually affect them. And the only effect would be to further immiserate Yemenis.
I just wanted to ask you something that I learned from this is that one of the reasons we're aligned with the Saudis or we're being so supportive of their genocide is this sort of like false notion that it'll keep them from interacting with China and Russia, and that somehow we'll sort of maintain this monopoly if they get all their love and attention. And that's not happening, and yet we're still doing this. So could you talk about that aspect? Because I thought that's really interesting. So not only are we doing this, but it's not even working.
Totally. And, I think Americans are sort of used to this idea that we have to hold our noses and deal with the Saudis because we're dependent on their oil. And we aren't anymore. The U.S. only imports 7% of oil from Saudi Arabia. And certainly the Saudis can have an impact on the price, but that sort of narrative that we have to go along with what the Saudis want for oil is just literally no longer true. And instead, it is this dynamic that unfortunately sort of comes along with this broader shift in Washington towards this sort of framework of great power competition, and this notion that the US has to be competing with China. Obviously now a lot more focus on Russia as a near peer competitor. And this notion that one of the only areas where the US can compete with China is in weapons sales. We can't compete with them economically, but we still have an edge as kind of the world's largest exporter of weapons, and we still have a reputation as sort of producing the latest, greatest, fanciest weapons. And so the concern is, if we, the United States, impose additional restrictions on what we sell to Saudi Arabia, if we make it harder for them to buy our weapons, that we're going to lose our market share, essentially, and that they will turn to China or perhaps Russia. And essentially what, so the question then is kind of like, so what? I mean, so the effect is that like Raytheon share prices go down. I mean, what exactly are we losing there, other than the fact that we wouldn't then be potentially drawn in backwards to fight a war on Saudi Arabia and the UAE's behalf, which is the concern we're running into now. Again, with that drone attack on Abu Dhabi, there were reports that it could have threatened US forces at the Al Dhafra Air Force Base, and the concern there being, if a US service member were killed, would Biden have declared war and gotten us into another war in the Middle East, which we know he doesn't want to do and Americans are fed up with. But if we've committed ourselves to defending Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it could very easily happen.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.